Welcome everyone to our next lesson. I know we have actually 3 lessons this week instead of just one, so I'm going to try to get through these very quickly, but very effectively as well. So in this section today, we're talking about sectarianism in Judea. And sectarianism, all that means is a sect. It's the way of sect. Not another word that sounds like that, but S-E-C-T, which means a denomination. It's denominationalism, is sectarianism. So we're going to be focusing in Judea, particularly a group called the Hasidim. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the definition of a hasid is noted for uncompromising observance of Judaic law. The Hasidians, or the Hasidim in Hebrew, joined the Maccabean revolt against the Hellenistic Seleucids to fight for religious freedom and stem the tide of paganism. So these were very anti-pagan, Torah-observant people, the Hasidim. They had no interest in politics as such, and they later withdrew from the Maccabean cause as soon as they had regained their religious freedom. Tradition pictures them as so devoted to Judaic law that martyrdom and torture were willingly preferred to the slightest violations of the Sabbath, according to 1 Maccabees 2:42. Historians tend to explain the disappearance of the Hasidim as gradual merging with the Pharisees. The Hasidim may also have had a doctrinal influence on the Essenes. So we'll also be talking about the Essenes, but today we're going to be talking about the more general Hasidim. Now, we have this character named Antigonus of Socho, and he is remembered in Josephus' writings, as it says, he was called Shimon Tzaddik, or Simon the Just, because of both his piety toward God and his kind disposition to those of his own nation. So basically, he's a very nice person, and he loves God. And he is known for saying the following, as quoted from Pirkei Avos 1:2. Pirkei Avos means the sayings of the fathers, or the ethics of the fathers. He said, "The world exists through 3 things: the Torah, the temple service, and acts of chesed, or loving kindness." He also said, "Do not be like servants who serve their master for the sake of being rewarded, but be like servants who serve their master not for the sake of being rewarded." So, being a hasid, actually, let's explain that passage real quick. What Shimon Tzaddik was saying there is, do not do the law to be saved, just so that you can get into heaven, but do it not for that sake. Do it as if there was no reward. Don't even think about the reward. Don't even think about getting into heaven. Don't think about all the blessings that God has for you. Why? Because it corrupts your motivations. So anyways, being a hasid, rather than just a bare minimum doer, which is a minimalist, we also see the priesthood became a model of holiness for all sects or denominations or groups of Judaism except the Hellenistic Jews. The Hellenistic Jews, as we remember from our previous lesson a week or so ago, that they did not observe the chukim. Remember? There's the mishpatim, which are basically it's the moral law, what we would call the moral law. There was the edot, which are things like Passover, the Sabbath, they're memorial commandments, right? The chukim were not generally observed by the Hellenistic Jews. And so what you might call the mainstream Jews, or Orthodox Jews, by the way, Orthodox just means you believe correctly. Orthodoxia just means you believe correctly. So the Jews that believed correctly, they accepted the entire Torah. They didn't, pick and choose which ones. They were much more prone to these acts of chesed. They were more prone to being a hasid, somebody who did chesed, somebody who did loving kindness. So hasidim go above and beyond the letter of the law. Now this terminology should sound familiar to us because we find these same words the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, in the New Testament itself, which we'll be looking at the end of the presentation. Hellenists, on the other hand, believed in doing the bare minimum and even rejected certain commandments that didn't make sense to them personally. So basically, their personal interpretation was supreme, and there was less of a regard for Scripture. Now let's look at the word chesed itself. We actually find this all throughout the Bible. Our first verse that we're going to be looking at is Genesis 39:21, which says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him chesed, mercy, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." If you remember, Joseph is in prison, and then he interprets the Pharaoh's dream, and then he becomes basically prime minister of Egypt as he rises to second in command. But it says, "The Lord was with Joseph and showed him chesed," mercy. In Exodus 20 verse 6 it says, "Showing chesed," mercy, "unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments." So God shows mercy, God shows this chesed unto thousands and thousands of people who love him and keep his commandments. Not just a select few who keep his commandments, but everybody who keeps his commandments. In 2 Samuel 2 verse 6 it says, "And now the Lord show chesed and truth unto you." Somebody is blessing the people here. Now, let's see. It says, "The Lord showed kindness," or chesed. In Psalm 69, verse 16, it says, "Hear me, O Lord, for thy chesed," loving kindness, "is good. Turn unto me according to the multitude of thy tender mercies." Remember, it says, "Lord, for thy chesed," thy loving kindness, "is good." These are just some examples of that word, chesed. Now, what about the people themselves? What about a chassid? It's spelled a little bit differently. It sounds almost the same, though. What about the hasidim? In Psalm 30, verse 4, it says, "Sing unto the Lord, O ye saints, chasido, O ye saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holiness." So here, the word chasido is being translated into English as saints. In Psalm 149 verse 1 it says, "Praise ye the Lord, sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise in the congregation of" the saints, the congregation of the hasidim. Now that's interesting. In Psalm 149 verse 5 it says, "Let his faithful people, let his hasidim rejoice in this honor and sing for joy on their beds." Now, I find it kind of interesting that this is being translated so many different ways. But beside from that, this should show us that the concept of there being hasidim did not originate during the Maccabean or Hasmonean period. It started all the way back, at least during the time of David, who wrote the Psalms, or at least most of the Psalms. So, like 1000 BCE. 1,000 years before Jesus' time, and over 800 years before the time of the Maccabees, and before the time that we're talking about today. So this is a very ancient kind of people. Now, it wasn't really a sect. It was more of this mindset that some people had. It was, if you wanted to be a chassid, then you would do certain things. You would show loving kindness. You would be pious. You would love God. You would love other people. You'd be merciful. These are all traits of a chassid. Now, there was a man named Antigonus of Soko. Soko is a town. And Antigonus' disciples were named Tzaddik and Bezos. And it claims that they were semi-Hellenists, meaning they were attracted to certain elements of the Hellenistic culture and lifestyle. And they misinterpreted Antigonus' instruction not to work for the reward, but work as if there was no reward, right? They misunderstood or twisted this, or they did something. And they concluded that there was no reward or punishment in the world to come. So basically, there's no heavenly afterlife, there's no punishment in hell. We just die. In fact, there's no afterlife at all. We know that this is a big lie because we see this all over the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and we see this all over, even more so, in the New Testament itself. So we know that the writers of the New Testament were definitely not like Tzaddik and Bezos. They also denied the authority of the sages, the Jewish sages, the rabbis who were acting as judges in the Great Assembly. Remember, the Sanhedrin. They did not acknowledge the authority of the Sanhedrin. They also denied all rabbinic interpretations, which are not plainly evident from Scripture, because it didn't jive with their rationalistic, Hellenistic, naturalistic worldview. And so, whatever didn't make sense to them personally, they told other people, oh, that's a bunch of garbage. And they got a little bit of a following, and Antigonus' disciples, Zadok and Basis, eventually became the founders of the Zadokim, meaning the Sadducees, and the Bezosim, or the Bothusians, which most of you probably, in fact probably all of you, have never heard of the Bothusians, and it's because they play a very small role, at least from what is recorded in our sources. But we've all heard of the Sadducees, right? They're all throughout the Gospels and the book of Acts. In fact, they're the prime villains in the book of Acts, constantly hassling the apostles and putting people in prison. These are those same people. The people that hated the rabbis, who hated the Sanhedrin, and at least the Sanhedrin at this time, they eventually came to join the Sanhedrin, and they started playing with things. They started messing things up. And that's why in the book of Acts we see Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Gamaliel, who was the teacher of Paul, although he's the leader of the Sanhedrin at that time, he has to kind of persuade or kind of hash out the matter of the disciples' preaching with the Sadducees that were part of that court at the time. But that's a totally different story from right now. So let's move on to our next slide. So again, continuing with the disciples of Antigonus of Soko, according to Josephus, he says, the Sadducees suppose that God is not concerned in our doing or not doing what is evil. Basically, they think that God doesn't care how we live. They think, well, because we're not going to be punished or rewarded in the afterlife, there's no point in even trying to do the right thing. But God told us to do it, so yeah, I guess we gotta try, just because he said so, but, you know. And they say that to act what is good, or what is evil, is at men's own choice, and that the one or the other belongs so to everyone, that they may act as they please. So like I said, basically, the Sadducees thought, just do whatever you want. They also take away the belief of the immortal duration of the soul and the punishments and rewards in Hades. So, again, they don't think that there's any kind of afterlife. Moreover, the Pharisees are friendly to one another and are for the exercise of concord and regard for the public, meaning they care about the general good. They don't just worry about themselves, they care about other people. But the behavior of the Sadducees one towards another is in some degree wild, and their conversation with those that are of their own party is as barbarous as if they were strangers to them. So basically, the Sadducees are just brutal to one another. They're hateful, they don't show any regard for one another, and it's just every man out for themselves, basically. As Josephus says, they're wild and barbarous. And they treat their comrades, their friends, as if they're strangers. Right? There's no regard for them. The Pharisees, on the other hand, treat each other well. They treat everyone well. At least most of the Pharisees. Again, these are generalizations. Now, what does Yeshua say? What does Jesus say in John 13, verses 34 through 35? He says, "Even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. And by this," by what? By this display of love, right? By this display of love, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So in comparing Yeshua's disciples, or Yeshua's teachings, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which ones are they closer to, and which ones are they more different from? The Pharisees, who, generally speaking, love one another, or the Sadducees, who are cutthroat and hate one another? They're closer to the Pharisees. Now, if we only read the New Testament, especially with a certain mindset that most of us have probably been taught in the church, we tend to come to the topic of the Pharisees and the Sadducees with this idea that both of them were wrong, both of them were just evil, wicked, nasty, horrible people. And then Jesus comes and then he found the true believers, right? Now, we see that Yeshua is actually teaching people in this singular way, in this particular instance, to be like the Pharisees. But because he criticizes certain Pharisees sometimes, and this is beside all the other times that the Pharisees are actually helping him, which most people are not familiar with, but he's showing them, be like them. Let's all, we're in this together. Let's love one another. Let's, show a little support for one another. In 1 John 4:20, we read, "Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God whom they have not seen." So what is being said? What are the implications for the Sadducees here? They hate one another. They're wild. They're barbarous. They're cutthroat. Is that they have no love. Whether they claim to or not, because they mistreat their fellows, that's the biggest sign that they actually hate God. Even if they say, "Oh, I love God." And this is not merely emotion here that we're talking about. This is the way that you treat people. If you help them when they're in need. Your friend's grandma across the street slips on the ice and they fall. You're going to let them lay out there and potentially die? "Oh, well, I love her in my heart." To hell with what you feel in your heart. Go out and help the lady. I mean, for crying out loud. This love is an action. Love is not, this nice, pleasant feeling that I get to enjoy over here apart from everyone else. This is how we treat one another. So moving on. Some examples from the New Testament of the hasidim. In Matthew 23, verse 2 through 12, Yeshua says, "The scribes and the Pharisees," remember, the Pharisees are the ones that love one another, unlike the Sadducees, "the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All, therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do." He's telling us to obey the scribes and the Pharisees. Why? Because they show that they love God because they love their neighbor. Again, at least most of them, or many of them. Or at the very least, the ideal Pharisee, what Phariseeism was all about, what they were supposed to be doing. And maybe many of the Pharisees weren't doing that, but that's still what they claim to stand for. And so Yeshua comes along and says, "Look, we're supposed to be doing this, you guys. We teach this, we talk about this all the time. Why aren't we actually doing it?" And that's actually what a lot of his complaints against the Pharisees is all about. We're talking about this a whole lot, and that's wonderful. It's beautiful stuff. Let's actually do it for once. And so he gives some examples in this passage of Matthew 23. He says, But do not ye after their works, but don't copy their actions." Why? "For they say and do not do." Again, is this every single Pharisee in the entire history of the world? No. These are certain Pharisees that Yeshua has in mind It's not all of them. Why? Because we're even told, especially in the book of John, of a lot of good Pharisees. And I know that might be shocking to some people, but there are a number of good Pharisees. For example, there's Nicodemus, who says, where it says of him that Nicodemus was a leader from among the Pharisees, and he comes to Yeshua and he says, "We know that you're a rabbi, and that you're sent from God, you're a teacher from God." Who's we? Well, it just called him Nicodemus, who was from the Pharisees. The Pharisees knew that he was a teacher from God. Again, did all the Pharisees know that he was a teacher from God? No, of course not. How are all the Pharisees on the entire planet supposed to know that? Most of them probably never even met Yeshua. But certain Pharisees, within the context of those Pharisees that Nicodemus knew, also knew that Yeshua was a teacher from God. We also have Nicodemus, who donates his tomb for Yeshua. We also have Paul, who was a Hebrew of Hebrews, from the strictest sect according to the law, a Pharisee. Remember? When he's being tried or questioned by the Sanhedrin, he says, "Look, I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection of the dead." And the Pharisees come to his defense, saying, "This man is innocent. Maybe an angel told him this." And the Sadducees are like, "That's nonsense. We don't even believe in angels." And a big fight happens because the party of the Pharisees is arguing in defense of Paul. There's amazing stuff here. Anyways, so continuing with Matthew 23. Jesus says, "For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So what's the problem here? They themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. They won't even lift a finger to help. And that's almost a literal translation there. Now again, are these the kind of Pharisees that Josephus is describing? No, they're acting like Sadducees. Yeshua is criticizing the Pharisees for acting like Sadducees. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their tefillin and enlarge their tzitzit on their garments. They love the upper rooms of feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues. And then skipping ahead because there's this whole list that we don't have time to go through today. In verse 11, "But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever shall exalt himself shall be abased," or humbled. "And he that shall humble himself shall be exalted." And Yeshua says elsewhere in that same chapter 23, he says, now this should really indicate to us that Yeshua is not criticizing any of their the actual traditions or Pharisaic practices. Because he says to the Pharisees, "You tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done, without neglecting the others." So wait, you tithe all these spices that are nowhere commanded in the written Torah, and then Yeshua says, but you've neglected the weightier, the more important stuff, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Which, then what does he say? You ought to have done these, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, without neglecting the others, tithing, mint, dill, and cumin. Now what's interesting, Yeshua says, you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, and chesed, mercy, and faithfulness. The Perushim, the Pharisees, who were within this Hasidic context, were neglecting chesed. Maybe that's what Yeshua's complaints are about a lot of the time. That they're neglecting the love that they claim to uphold. Should maybe put some things in perspective. In Matthew 5, verses 15 through 20, it says, Neither do men light a candle and put it underneath a bushel, but on a candlestick. This is especially appropriate with Hanukkah being around. And it giveth the light unto all that are in the house. Especially if you're celebrating Hanukkah and put it next to the window, then even people outside can see your light, right? This is not actually talking about Hanukkah, it's talking about good works, as we'll see. Verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Think not that I am come to destroy the law, or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For truly I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, the Torah, till all be fulfilled. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least mitzvot, one of these little commandments, and shall teach men to do so, so if you're breaking the Torah and you're teaching people to break the Torah, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. You're the person living under a bridge in the kingdom of heaven. Right? That's not exactly what we want to be aiming for. But whosoever... Oh, good, there's another option. We don't have to pick that option. But whosoever shall do and teach them, shall teach the commandments, the mitzvot, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So basically, these hasidim go above and beyond the letter of the law. Well, at least that's what they claim. As disciples of Yeshua, he was teaching them, you need to do more than that. There's the letter of the law, which the Sadducees claim to keep, but they don't even actually keep. Then there's the spirit of the law, in addition to the written law, that the Pharisees claim and try to do, at least many of them. But as followers of Jesus, they need to go even above that. Not just the written law, not just the written and the spirit of the law, or the oral law, but above that. We need to be hasidim. And actually, at the end of this course, we'll be talking about how the resurrection of this Hasidic movement on a large scale through a man named the Baal Shem Tov, who, it's amazing. The similarities between the Baal Shem Tov and Yeshua are astounding. Like, I got chills and I was almost crying when I was reading these things. It's like, this is almost the same guy. It's truly amazing stuff. They're casting out demons, they're healing people, they're performing miracles, they're teaching love one another. It's so many different things. They're teaching chesed. They're teaching Hasidic principles. In Acts 21:20, continuing with the Hasidim, and Paul now. In Acts 21:20, James is talking to Paul, and he says, you see, brother, how many myriades, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They're not just, for the law. They're zealous, they're passionate, they want to go out and do it. They want to go fulfill every commandment there is. They want to be Hasidic. They want to be Hasidim. Now, Paul himself says in Acts 22:3, he says, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but raised in this city, Jerusalem. I was educated at the feet of Rabban Gamaliel, in strict conformity to the law of our fathers. I am just as zealous for God as any of you are here today. Now, what is Paul saying? He didn't just live in conformity to the law. He didn't just do what it said. He lived in strict conformity to it. Implying, especially when he says elsewhere that he's a Pharisee, that he was going above and beyond what he should have been doing. Now, we all think that Paul, prior to his Damascus Road experience, was some evil guy. even though we're only told one sin that he does, which is persecuting the church. But when there was rumors going around that the church was lawless, you can understand why he might do this, because he loves God's Torah so much, he wants to make sure that the lawless Jesus followers, which they weren't actually lawless, this was a rumor, that they stopped doing this, because he cared about God so much. But it's kind of like he says somewhere else, I think in Romans, it's zeal without knowledge. He didn't know, he just didn't realize that the Nazarenes, the Jesus believers, were not actually contrary to Torah. They were promoting a higher level of Torah observance than anybody. They were saying, we gotta be super zealous and super strict about keeping the Torah. But he didn't know this because, how many Nazarenes do you think he was talking to if he heard that, there's some wicked group of people here? In Romans 2:29, it says, or Paul says, but he who is a Jew is one on the inside, and circumcision is of the heart, in spirit, not in letter, of whom the praise is not of men, but of God. People like to use this to actually say that the law is done away with because, the spirit of the law is whatever I interpret it to be. It's the intention of the law. That is not how it's interpreted in Judaism. In Jewish thought, the spirit of the law, it goes beyond the letter of the law. If we remember from earlier, the spirit is more than what's written, not less. If the Bible says, don't eat these unkosher things, they'll say, we're not going to eat them, we're not going to touch them, we don't even want to look at them. We want nothing to do with them. That's kind of the general idea that we're getting. In Romans 7 verse 6, he says, we must serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter. Again, people think that this is doing away with what's written. Far from it. Paul is saying we need to be serving with this hasidic mindset. That we need to be serving with this zeal, this passion, this spirit of holiness that desires to do what's right and to be set apart. Now, if all the people in your country are keeping a bare minimum level of Torah observance and you want to be holy, you want to be set apart, then what do? You go above and beyond that. Kind of like with what Yeshua was saying. Kind of like what with the hasidim mentioned in Psalms. Kind of like what we've been talking about the whole time, right? Let's see, this is not crucial per se, but in fact, if you want to pause the slide, you're welcome to. But we know that James, who was the brother of Jesus, was called Yaakov Tzaddik, which means James the Just. And according to Clement of Alexandria, he was called the Just because of his outstanding virtue. Now, outstanding virtue is, in some sense, relative, because if everybody has outstanding virtue, how does that make you particularly stand out? It doesn't. It still means you're a very good person, but it doesn't mean that you stand out. Clement says that he had outstanding virtue. And in fact, when we read the ancient accounts of the death of James, the Pharisees were friends with James. And you can understand why this might not be a very popular piece of history. The Pharisees admired James. They even said to him, look, you're a respectable guy. How about you come over here and tell the people, set them straight about a certain issue. And James actually complies with them. Now, he doesn't do it exactly the way that they want him to, but it's because they're saying, go teach them that Yeshua is not the Messiah. And he gets up and says, attention everyone. Yeshua is the Messiah. Have a good day. And of course, that doesn't make these particular people happy. But the very fact that they went to him at all shows that they considered him an outstandingly virtuous person. Now what's interesting is that Tzaddik itself means the just one, or the righteous one. Tzedakah means righteousness and charity. It's the same word. So when you are giving charity, you are doing something that's righteous. Now, we also find this Shimon, or Simon, who's called Simon the Zealot, in Matthew 10:4. And the Zealots were basically a radical. They eventually turned into almost a terroristic wing of the Pharisees. They were very violent. And according to Josephus, these men agree in all other things with the Pharisaic notions. So we have Simon the Zealot, who was probably a Pharisee who joined Jesus. We see more of them in Josephus's writings cited below. Now, as I mentioned before, and as some of you are already probably familiar with, Paul called himself a Pharisee in numerous places, such as Acts 23:6, Philippians 3:5, and he says things like, I am a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, concerning the Torah, I'm a Pharisee. So we should start to be seeing that Phariseeism and what you might call Nazareneism, or the early church, were actually not quite as different as we've been taught. Now, for the sake of time, if you would like to read these scholarly opinions from, I think these are all from Gezer Vermesh, which is a phenomenal historian of the Jewish Jesus. He's not only a brilliant analyst of ancient sources, but also he is. It's hard to describe it. It's just he finds some amazing text out there, and he I don't know how he gets a hold of them, but he does. But you have those quotes at your disposal, so hopefully while I've been talking, you paused it and maybe took a look at them, or maybe you could now. Go ahead, you can do it. Anyways, okay, moving on. Rabbinic opinion about being a hasid. There is a modern book called To Be Hasidic, a contemporary guide by Rabbi Chaim Dolphin, who says, traditional Judaism calls the code that we need to live by, din, or law, right? It's a court of law, a beit din. Din contains the required commandments, the required laws. Matters that are good and praiseworthy, although not obligated by law, are called lifnim misparas hadin, more than the letter of the law. Remember, these are praiseworthy, although not obligated. They are also called midat hasidus, measuring things by the Hasidic yardstick. Hasidic in this sense being the pious, the praiseworthy, the virtuous, the loving kindness, the mercy yardstick. Midat Hasidut, or Midas Hasidus. Let's see, it looks like that's the end of our presentation. I stuck to about half an hour, which is good. So I suggest that if you have some time, maybe go on to the next lesson, or if not, then try to catch the next lesson at another time. So have a good day, and be a hasid. Go above and beyond what's required, and be merciful, be kind, show some love, and smile at someone today, and spread that love. We'll talk to you later.